Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today I want to talk about the levels of knowledge in the Quran. And what I mean by that is I want to talk about the ways that the Quran describes people who have knowledge. Because when we have discussions in Islamic discourse, we usually use the word, if we're speaking English, we use the word scholar, which in English has a little bit different meaning than most people would intend in those discussions. And then in Arabic, a lot of times as a plural, we use the word ulama or we use the word sheikh. And so our discussion of the description of those who have knowledge becomes very limited as compared to the discussion in the Quran. If you look at the discussion of those who have knowledge in the Quran, it's so much more meticulous and it's so much more detailed. So in this talk, I'd like to share some of that with you. So the first description is the word alim, which the plural of is alimun. And the word alim is ismul fa'il, meaning it's the noun representing the doer of an action. So if you start off with the verb alima, to know something, and then you say alim, you're saying someone who knows something, and then the plural of that is alimun. So we find this in the Quran a few times describing people of knowledge. And why I think it's important to look at these terms and look at the meticulous nature as far as the way the Quran describes it is because the way that we use them in Islamic discourse, the way that we use these terms like scholar and stuff like that in Islamic discourse, I believe differs from how the Quran presents it. So let's look and see. So here he says in 29:43, وَتِلْكَ الْأَمْثَالُ نَضْرِبُهَا لِلنَّاسِ, and those are the parables that we present to people. وَمَا يَعْقِلُهَا إِلَّا الْعَالِمُونَ, and none is able to understand them except al-alimun, except those who have knowledge. Now, if you look at the context, this is 29:43, and you go up to 41 and 42, you see what parable is being given here is a parable of a spider. مَثَلُ الَّذِينَ اتَّخَذُوا مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ أَوْلِيَاءَ كَمَثَلِ الْعَنْكَبُوتِ, that the parable or the example of the one who take besides Allah or less than Allah, awliya, friends and protectors, is like the example of the spider. And then after he gives this example, he says, وَمَا يَعْقِلُهَا إِلَّا الْعَالِمُونَ, none understands these parables except for al-alimun, those who have knowledge. So even though it's relating it to a religious topic, those who take awliya besides Allah, the thing that's being understood, which is the parable, is not religious in nature. It's something that exists in the natural world. So in order to understand it, we have to start thinking about spiders. We have to think about what is Baytul Ankabut, what is the home of the spider, the web of the spider, all these different things we have to think about in order to grasp this parable. And if you look in the Quran and other places, it's the same thing. Parables that he gives a lot of times are parables of the natural world, right? Gives a parable of a dog, he gives a parable of a donkey, these different type of things. So when he says those are the parables which we put forth for people and none understands them except al-alimun, then we're going to have something beyond religious knowledge to understand those parables. We're going to have to maybe know some biology. We're going to have to know some different things about nature and stuff like that. So people who are more versed in those things, more versed in the knowledge of nature and its processes, is probably going to understand that parable better. Okay, again, we find this word alim in the plural in this verse here in 30:22. He says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, and from his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ, and the differences in variation in your tongues and colors. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالِمِينَ, in that are signs for people who have knowledge. What is he talking about? What is their signs in? The differences in your tongues and colors. So your tongues relate to language and linguistics. Your colors perhaps relate to things like biology, sociology, things that relate to culture and groups of people. And so in those things are signs for al-alimin, those who have knowledge. So people who study linguistics, study languages, people who study sociology, they study anthropology, they understand cultures and things of that nature. They're going to get more signs out of the differences in the tongues and colors than would someone who only has specific religious knowledge. So my point is, when you look at the description of people who have knowledge in the Quran, it's not always just connected to religious knowledge. If you look in chapter 12, verse 44, when the king in the story of Yusuf had the dream and he asked his council to interpret it, And then they said, قالوا أضغاث أحلام. They said, these are mixed up false dreams. وما نحن بتأويل الأحلام بعالمين. And we are not knowledgeable, alimin, about the interpretation of dreams. So here, the word ilm and alim and alimin is related to the interpretation of dreams. And this is interesting because the interpretation of dreams could have something to do with psychology, because this is one of the things that they study in psychology is what do dreams actually mean. This was a big part of Sigmund Freud's psychology. So we, in these different verses, in the first verse, we found that it was related to the natural world, which are things like biology and things of that nature. In the second verse, we found that alimin was related to things like linguistics and sociology. And in this verse, we find that alimin is related to something like psychology. Now, what's interesting is that the word that's most frequently used as a plural in Islamic discourse is not usually alimun for the plural of what people call scholars. It's usually the word ulama, ulama. But that word is only found 2 times in the Qur'an. The first time is in chapter 26, 197. He says, أَوَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُمْ آيَةً أَنْ يَعْلَمَهُ عُلَمَاءُ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلِ. Is it not an ayah for them that the children of Israel know the Qur'an meaning? So the ulama of Bani Israel is being referenced here, and it's being referenced that is it not a sign for people that they know the Qur'an, that they recognize it? Now, why specifically is the ulama of Bani Israel being referenced here? And isn't this related to religious knowledge? Yes and no. Yes, it's talking about they know and recognize the Qur'an, and they're ulama of this particular group of people. But I believe, and we're going to compare it to the next verse to show you why I believe this, or one of the reasons why I believe this. I believe that why the word ulama is used here is not just talking about their knowledge as far as the information they have. It's talking about the perspective they have. Meaning, just because they're from Bani Israel, they're from the children of Israel, they're not just biased to their group. They recognize the truth when they see it. So here the knowledge isn't so much just the information they have, it's the perspective that it gives them. It's a certain kind of knowledge that's not just connected to this world where people see these differences and they make divisions because of them. As Allah tells us in another verse about people who only have knowledge of this world. He says, وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. However, most people do not have knowledge. يَعْلَمُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَهُمْ عَنِ الْآخِرَةِ هُمْ غَافِلُونَ. They know the surface of the life of this world, but they are heedless of the hereafter. So most people don't have knowledge, but what they do have knowledge of is the surface of the life of this world. So most people don't have knowledge. So here the ulama of Bani Israel, they're not just looking at things on the surface. That's their perspective. They have a different kind of knowledge than most people, where they're able to see the truth when it comes to them. And what I believe supports this interpretation is the only other place that the word ulama is used is 35:28. And it's talking about the variation in colors amongst people and animals and livestock. He says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ وَالدَّوَابِ وَالْأَنْعَامِ مُخْتَلِفٌ أَلْوَانُهُ كَذَلِكَ. And from people and animals and livestock are variations in colors likewise. إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء. It is only those amongst his servants who are ulama, who have the khashya, the awe, the respect, the fear of him. So why is the ulama mentioned specifically with the variations of colors in people and animals and livestock? Perhaps again, that's showing that they see something different when they look at the variations of colors amongst people than the average person would, because their knowledge gives them a different perspective. So it's not about the amount of knowledge. Like a lot of times when we use this word in our Islamic discourse, ulama or scholar, we look at someone who has memorized a certain amount, who has the ability to give fatwa, all these different things. But really, even if a person had a small amount of information, but they had a certain perspective on life, connected more with the akhirah, connected more with transcending the worldly things and seeing the signs in the things around them, then perhaps they could be from the ulama. And that's why when we go back to the other verse where it referenced ulama Bani Israel, that they can see it. They can see the Qur'an as being true because they're not just caught up on their group. They see something different when they look at the things of this world. Now, the next description of knowledge, or actually the next two, we'll kind of cover them both at the same time, of people who have knowledge in the Qur'an is dhu ilmin, the one who possesses some knowledge, and alim, the one who is deeply endowed with knowledge. And we find both of these descriptions in Surah Yusuf. And there's actually something really interesting about this. So if you look in chapter 12, Surah Yusuf, verse 55, Yusuf describes himself with the quality of alim. He says, Ij'alni ala khaza'in al-ard, place me upon the storehouses of the land. Inni hafidhun alim. I am hafidh, I have the ability to guard and to take care of it, and I am alim. I am deeply endowed with knowledge. Now, if you turn the page, go to the very next page in verse 68, we find Yaqub, his father, is described as dhu ilm, the possessor of some knowledge. So he says, وَإِنَّهُ لَذُو عِلْمٍ لِمَا عَلَّمْنَاهُ. Truly, he is someone endowed or possessing. Dhu means possessing some knowledge because we have taught him, or of what we have taught him. Right? Okay, so follow. First, Yusuf is described as alim, deeply endowed with knowledge. Then Yaqub is described as dhu ilmin, someone who possesses some knowledge. So he has a different description. And then if we go right to the next page in verse 76, we find this phrase at the end of the verse. It says, وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. Above every dhu ilm is an alim. Right? Levels of knowledge. Most times when people interpret this verse, they interpret it as meaning above everyone who has some knowledge is the all-knowing. They interpret alim here as being Allah. But because of the context, if you follow the context of the verses, where Yusuf is first described or describes himself with alim, then Yaqub is described with dhu ilm, and then it says وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. Above every dhi ilmin or dhu ilmin is an alim, meaning that dhu ilm is a certain level of knowledge, and alim is a level of knowledge that is above it. SubhanAllah, how meticulous the Qur'an talks about the levels of knowledge, and we kind of just talk about it in this really reductive way, where we just say the word scholar, or we say the plural ulama, and we don't really respect the meticulous nature of how the Qur'an talks about it. Now, let's explore a little bit more about this description, dhu ilm versus alim. And why would it be that above dhu ilm would be alim? Why is dhu ilm a lesser level of knowledge? Well, perhaps if we look at the word dhu in the Qur'an, the prefix dhu, which means basically to own or possess something, is telling us that the thing that's owned and possessed is not necessarily a permanent part of you, or something that comes about only at certain times. Whereas the word alim is a noun, and it means something that's a consistent part of a person. Okay? And perhaps we can see this from chapter 2, verse 280, where he says, وَإِنْ كَانَ ذُو عُسْرَةٍ, he's talking about the one who is in debt, if that person is ذُو عُسْرَةٍ. So they usually translate it as that if that person is in a state of difficulty. But the literal way it's saying it is ذُو عُسْرَةٍ. He is someone who is in possession of some usra, some difficulty. Now, what's interesting is if you read the rest, فَنَظِرَةٌ إِلَى مَيْسَرَةٍ, then you should wait until it becomes easy. So dhu usratin is not a permanent quality. It's a quality that comes about at certain times. So perhaps we can use that to understand the idea of why dhu ilmin is a lesser knowledge than alim. Because dhu ilmin is something that comes about at certain times or is related to certain situations, whereas alim is someone who has a more deeply endowed, deeply entrenched knowledge and a more wide array of subjects that he knows about. Look at Yusuf is described as being alim, and look at the wide array of subjects he talks about in Surah Yusuf. He interprets dreams, he teaches them about religion. There's a discussion in the prison about religion. He does all these different he does all these different things. He controls the storehouses of the land. He knows how to do that. So he's alim. He's someone who is deeply endowed with knowledge and on a wide array of subjects. Whereas someone who is dhu ilmin, he possesses some knowledge, but it's situational. It's contextual. It comes at sometimes and doesn't come at sometimes. And Allah knows best. Another place that we can possibly see that this is why dhu ilm is a lesser knowledge or a lesser level is because if you look at this word dhu in other places, so if you look at 55:12, he says wal habbu dhul asfi, the seed that is dhul asfi, it possesses the asf, which is like the husk or the dry outer covering of some fruits or seeds. So that comes off. You take that off. So dhul asfi is not something that stays on it. It's not the essential part. It's on there for a time and then it comes off. So perhaps that gives us another indication that when we use the word dhu in connection with knowledge, it's not meaning a consistent thing in a lot of different situations and a lot of different subjects. It means it comes up in certain situations and on limited subjects. Another comparison that shows us that, and I really like this one because this just really shows how the Qur'an fits together as one coherent whole. In 38:1, he says, Sad wal Qur'ani the dhikr. By the Qur'an, that is the dhikr. It possesses a dhikr. It possesses reminder. So you would say, oh, that's part of the Qur'an. Yes, but look at this other verse, chapter 20, verse 113. وَكَذَلِكَ أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا وَصَرَّفْنَا فِيهِ مِنَ الْوَعِيدِ. He said, and likewise we have sent it down as an Arabic Qur'an, and we have distributed in it of different warnings, لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ, perhaps they may have taqwa, أَوْ يُحْدِثُ لَهُمْ ذِكْرًا, or there will be brought about or come about for them a dhikr, a reminder. So the dhikr has to go through a process to come about. Yes, the Qur'an is the dhikr, right? But the word the here, or which is from dhu, right? It shows us that the dhikr, it exists there, but it exists situationally, contextually, meaning if you don't go through a process to bring the dhikr about, it won't exist for you. So again, that supports this idea that why is dhu ilmin a lesser level than alim, perhaps, is because dhu ilmin indicates that the knowledge is not a permanent, consistent part of the person who has it. So look at how beautiful, like when we think about describing people who have knowledge, just think if we developed, we're not even finished, we have some more, but just to pause and reflect, just think if we had a curriculum, like a school curriculum, where we describe the levels of knowledge like the Quran does, right? We had alim, alimun, we had alim, we had dhu ilmin, etc. SubhanAllah, the Quran is beautiful. The next description I want to talk about is ar-rasikhuna fil ilm, which is usually translated as those firmly endowed or those firmly grounded in knowledge. So this is mentioned 2 times in the Quran. And again, this shows the beauty of the interconnectedness of the Quran. So in 3:7, chapter 3, verse 7, he talks about the ayat of the book. He says, Minhu ayatun muhkamatun hunna ummul kitab wa ukharu mutashabihat. That from it are ayat which are muhkamat, they are the mother of the book, and others are mutashabihat. Without unpacking these words, because there's a lot to these words, but I just want you to pay attention to the connection with mutashabihat, okay? And then later he says, in the same verse, 3:7, وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ يَقُولُونَ آمَنَّا بِهِ كُلٌّ مِّنْ عِنْدِ رَبِّنَا. And those who are ar-rasikhuna, they're firmly endowed or firmly grounded in knowledge, they say we believe in it, all of it is from our Lord. But see, there's something in this context connected with them, with that description, and this word mutashabihat. And the reason I say that is because if you go to the only other place where ar-rasikhuna fil ilmi is mentioned in the whole Quran, which is chapter 4, verse 162, he says, لَكِنَ الرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ مِنْهُمْ. However, those firmly grounded in knowledge amongst them. This is in 4:162. If you just look up a little bit to 4:157, it's talking about Isa and killing him or crucifying him. And it says, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. They did not kill him nor crucify him, but rather it was shubbiha lahum. It was made to appear as so. So this word shubbiha from the same root as mutashabihat. So is it a coincidence that in the only two places that ar-rasikhuna fil ilmi is mentioned, in 3:7 and here in this verse in 4:162, right in the immediate context is mentioned variations of the same root word, mutashabihat and shubbiha lahum. So mutashabihat and shubbiha lahum are referring to things that aren't clear, right? Because they did not kill him, they didn't crucify him. Walakin shubbiha lahum. It was made to appear it's not clear to them. So in both cases, ar-rasikhuna fil ilmi, those firmly grounded in knowledge, are related to being able to figure out unclear things. So this level of knowledge perhaps is talking about a level of knowledge that's so deep that these are the people, when really confusing things come about, they're the ones that you call on to be able to figure them out. Then another description that we find is in 3:18, which is ulul ilm, which as a plural, meaning those who possess knowledge. Another description, which is in chapter 30, verse 56, is alladhina utul ilm, those who were given knowledge. Another description of those who have knowledge in the Qur'an is found in chapter 27, verse 40, where he says, alladhina indahu, alladhi indahu ilmun min al-kitab, the one who is with him the knowledge of the book. So this is just a brief discussion just to show some reflections on how the Qur'an describes those who have knowledge, and why I think the way that we talk about it generally in a lot of our Islamic discourse is a little short-sighted or is a little limited. And the Qur'an is so much more meticulous. And all of these categories we should reflect on more, because I'm not going to say what I said exhaust those categories, because it definitely doesn't. It's just some reflections to get us thinking about how the Qur'an describes it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.